I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
You
palpable.
don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
We laughed.
more of a community.
Before China took back over.
currently doing in autism.
In his latest work, renowned photographer and researcher Richard Ross opens our eyes to the harsh realities of America's juvenile justice system. For his new book, Juvenile In Justice, Ross photographed and interviewed more than 1,000 youths over a 5-year period in juvenile detention facilities around the country. The result is powerful and haunting. We'll talk with Ross about juvenile justice, the power of the still photograph, and about where he'll be focusing his camera next. Here's our conversation with Richard Ross. Richard Ross, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Patty.
Before we talk about your latest photographic project, Juvenile In Justice, I want to talk a little bit about what led you there. You were probably best known for, I think it was your fourth book, the fourth book you ever wrote, Architecture of Authority, a photographic examination of how architectural spaces exert a kind of power over the people who are in those buildings. You did a photographic examination on museums and how art is displayed, on light, on Waiting for the End of the World, a book which was about bomb shelters in the U.S. and across the world. And these projects took you literally all around the world. How did those kinds of things lead you to examine juvenile justice through photographs?
I was used to working with architecture. Only peripherally was I working with people. The Architecture of Authority got me some recognition that I was hoping for but didn't quite expect.
A Guggenheim
was a nice
fellowship.
thing. And some other notices and shows and just general recognition amongst a world that was pretty well spelled out in terms of my hierarchy of accomplishment. And then success is a very dangerous mistress. If you fail, you know you can go to anywhere and have an opportunity to explore new territory. When you're successful, I wasn't sure where to turn. And being in Southern California, so close to LA and Hollywood, the natural instinct is to say, son of, or the sequel. Architecture of Authority Part 2 made no sense, although I was perfectly willing to keep on exploring it. But then I looked at all the images I had of kids and spaces that kids occupied. My kids had gone through high school. They hated high school. I looked at the architecture of high school. I had looked at the architecture of the Montessori school where everybody sits on a circle. We're sitting in a circle now, which defines us as being equal. If I would be above you or you would be above me, the architecture would say something different about who's in power and who's subordinate. When the presidential candidates speak from a dais, it's to elevate them above everybody else, intellectually, in terms of authority. And then I went down to Texas and had access to some of the juvenile system there.
Your cousin works.
My cousin was a juvenile prosecutor. And he said, come look at the facilities we have. And at the end of that visit, where I photographed extensively, I said, do you ever think you'll be so successful that you'll be out of a job? And he said, not as long as the state of Texas keeps on making 10-year-olds. And I was taken aback by that. And then he said, Texas isn't, there's no notoriety here.
Although it has a higher incarceration rate than other states.
High incarceration rate, but they're very transparent about, yes, you can come to Texas and visit and see our facilities. We know things are broken. We value you being willing to come and explore and make your findings known. Then I discovered that 22 states, including the District of Columbia, will take kids 7 years old and older into custody.
And for things that are shocking. In fact, I think in your book, you wrote about someone who stole a bagel and someone from the facility, the detention facility, said, this child doesn't belong here.
Well, that was a great use of the photographs where in Washoe County, a 5th grader was taken into custody And when I went to school, there were no police in the schools. Now about 70% of institutions have school police. In Harris County, which is Texas, school districts hire their own police. So they have autonomy well beyond even the normal policing authority. And when the child took something, got in a fight, fifth grader, instead of resolving the situation as you or I might, school police were brought in. They have a certain protocol. The kid had to be brought into a detention center. It was 10:30 in the morning. The mother couldn't get the fifth grader until about 6:30, single parent when she got off work. And all of a sudden you have a fifth grader there in a stark concrete cell, no belt, no shoes because of suicide watch. And I had to say to the kid, don't worry, your mommy will come and get you. It's just, and then the administrator said, can I have your image and show the principals and say to the principals, when you bring in the school police, this is the protocol that you invoke. This is not a place for kids, therefore change your procedure.
This photographic exploration took you 5 years to complete. And in fact, it's really, in a lot of ways, an ongoing process.
It hasn't stopped.
Yes, it hasn't stopped. It took you you talked with 1,000 incarcerated youth in 31 states and visited 200 or so facilities. How difficult was access? You mentioned that it was relatively easy in Texas, and actually Pennsylvania turned out to be a welcoming state. But in general, how difficult was access?
It's all a negotiation. And my practice as an artist, normally people sometimes have a question about photography as art. That's sort of like 1930s argument. But when they realize that most of my practice now is on the phone or on a computer, each image I take probably represents anywhere from 10 to 100 emails. And then by the time I get into a facility, fly there, sit in a cell, because from the Architecture of Authority project, I've discovered that the best way to get access to a kid is to sit on the floor of an 8x10 cell and spend a half an hour with the kid above me so that they have the authority and the power to realize that I'm not the tall, old, white guy that's giving them instructions, but they're an authority above me. They can cut me off at any time.
Most were willing to talk, interested in talking.
They're teenagers. They're bored. They're drama kings and queens. They're glad somebody's paying attention to them, and I'm glad to be listening to them.
You said that this project, that you burned bridges in front of you as a result of this project. And we should note that these images you're giving to people for free to distribute them, which isn't something
Great
most
marketing
photographers
strategy.
do.
So it's sort of like the joke, I lose money on every suit I sell, but I make it up in volume. I'm doing it with some support from the Annie Casey Foundation. Getting the Guggenheim helped give me the time and a little bit of funds to really start this project, but I had to keep my mouth shut about it for the first 5 years I was doing it. Because if people understood the power of the photographs and started really, administrators saw the body of evidence that I had, they wouldn't let me in there. It would be really burning the bridges in front of me. But then in October, Rick MacArthur, who's the publisher of Harper's, who did the introduction to the Architecture of Authority book, some of my friends knew about the work. And he said, you've done a longitudinal study. You've got a significant body of research. Let us publish it. We'll give you as much space as you want. We'll let you write anything you want. Whatever you want to do, we'll give it to you, but you should publish it now.
The isolation and the despair that you feel when you look at these photographs is, it really, words aren't adequate to describe that. And these are pictures of kids mostly from the back. If they aren't from the back, their faces are blurred. This is one of the things you negotiated because, of course, they're minors. Talk a little bit about, you said, the power of the photograph. What are these images doing?
Well, no matter what they describe the conditions, an administrator can make it the most beautiful room possible. They can do their best. But if you have a Four Seasons room and the door is locked, you're a prisoner, no matter what the facility is. Your liberty is taken away from you. Here I obscured the kids' faces because I wanted to generalize, not only a memorandum of understanding, so that it wasn't just a caricature of that kid. You could see about the age of the kid, the gender, the race of the kid, but you could identify and you could empathize more of all the things we did when we were teenagers. Teenagers, by definition, screw up.
Delinquency is part of adolescence.
And one of the problems here is that we've criminalized normal, abnormal teenage behavior. Rather than dealing with it on a rational basis, we've created the set of procedures that criminalize, demonize, and incarcerate kids when the majority of them are being normal teenagers.
On a given day, how many youth are incarcerated in juvenile detention facilities across the country?
Depending on how you define detention, the statistics range anywhere from 70 to 90,000 kids per day.
Per day, at a cost of $88,000 per year per child, which is almost more than three times what it costs, or almost three times what it costs to incarcerate an adult.
Again, it's one of those situations of you look at the figures, and any case is great for collecting data. But I shot up at Alameda Detention Center, which is Oakland, California. They spend $224,000 per year per kid. So that's almost $250,000.
And it's $8,000 a year for college, a year of college.
Well, now the state of California raises tuition, and my students at UC Santa Barbara can't get into classes because so much money is spent on incarcerating kids and not enough is spent on educating kids.
How did we get into this? Why do we incarcerate youth who, according to this book and others, kids who pose relatively little risk? There are kids in there who have murdered, but most of them are in for nonviolent offenses.
Again, I'm a photographer. I am not a criminologist. I'm not a sociologist. But from what I've read, from who I've spoken to, about 12.5% of the kids that are in there may be defined as sociopaths. A lot of them have emotional and mental health needs that aren't being addressed. A lot of them come from poverty. A lot of them come from unsupervised or undersupervised homes. For a lot of them, the educational process has failed. And there are, for example, there are a tremendous number of kids that are in there for status offenses, that they do something wrong, they're put out on probation, they violate
Violation
probation.
of parole.
Or probation. It depends on how they're categorized. But how many kids in this country have smoked weed? And if you're out on probation or parole and it's Friday night with a bunch of your friends, do you understand the consequences of your actions? Has your prefrontal cortex developed to the level that it should have developed? I don't think so. Sometimes they're given second chances. Sometimes there are great people within the probation system that really look to the benefit of the kid and deal with diversions rather than incarcerations. But the numbers don't lie. We're spending too much money and throwing away too many lives for the wrong reasons.
Speaking of second chances, you are working at the University of California, Santa Barbara with Victor Rios, who got a second chance. He went on to earn a PhD, and he works with you and your wife on, this book has become a class. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's great. I mean, we have a multidisciplinary program at UC Santa Barbara, but never quite. The administration's always talking about doing a great job. They never quite figured it out. So Victor, my wife Sissy, and I got together and we said we can do this sort of under the radar. And we all met and sort of like exchanged notes in classes, and rather than changing how courses were structured, we scheduled things at the same time, and we all would interject each other into each other's classes and open up office hours for each other's students.
So kids are writing about juvenile justice, for example, and Rios is as a sociologist.
He's teaching them methodology. My wife Sissy's teaching them academic writing and journalism. I'm teaching them photography, and we're all teaching them how to care, get involved, and have a voice in the procedure. And then we brought in all speakers. Brought in the editor from Colors magazine from Venice. Bart Lubau came from DC. The police chief came. David Innocencia, who writes The Beat Within with kids within detention centers. he came. Karen Grau, who is a filmmaker from Ohio, came. And people were so generous they would come gratis or just for minimal expenses. And everybody was behind getting this program going, and it's become something.
And in fact, you credit Bart Lubau with changing your anger at what you saw into effective advocacy.
He's very soft-spoken, he's very well-mannered, and he's taught me that I have a limited number of battles I can fight, and when I get frustrated with getting into different systems, I have to figure out the energy versus the reward and figure out where I can apply my work, where I can gather the research I'm doing, and where I have to avoid it, where I have to avoid just getting so mad at people.
I think one of the proudest moments as a result of this photographic exploration is a Senate subcommittee used your images as part of a discussion on federal legislation to prevent pretrial juveniles, kids who have been detained but they have not yet been to trial, from being housed with kids who have committed serious crimes. And you said it's great to know that your work, quote, was being used for advocacy rather than the masturbatory art world I grew up in.
You can say that? Yeah, my world had a certain hierarchy of the exhibitions at the major museums, the books being recognized by certain people. That was what I grew up in. That was what I felt I was pleasing my parents, who are long gone, with the expectations of what a project should be in terms of being celebrated or recognized. And now being able to write a letter to a judge in Miami regarding a kid that's been held for 4 years and 4 months without a trial, in spite of the Sixth Amendment, and knowing that that judge feels that he's a little under scrutiny of a broader public with his actions, gives me a degree of satisfaction. Knowing that the work, that the Supreme Court ruled that kids under 16 cannot be sentenced to life without parole. A suit brought by the Equal Justice Initiative of Montgomery, Alabama, about 3 months ago, and a 5-4 ruling that you can't give kids life without parole. Maybe my work had some tiny bit of moving things along. Statistics are critical, legal briefs are critical, but then you look at these kids' faces, blurred or not, and you know that there are lives at stake here. It's a great feeling.
In fact, each photograph in this book, and there are about 150 of them, have a little story. There's one that I really can't shake. It's a young man reclining on a cot, and he's holding a piece of paper with his personal timeline. And it's literally one disaster after another from the day he was born. Abusive parents, drug-addicted mother, stepfathers who beat him. There's some who talk about being electrocuted, hands burned, young girls, all of them in one facility that you visited in Rosemead, California. Every one of them had been sexually abused prior to their incarceration.
I asked the director of that institution what percentage, and he said every one. And it floored me. And then he turned around and said, most of the boys are physically, mentally, and sexually abused as well. So you look at these kids as being horrendous. We went through the 90s with the concept of super predators, and very few people have stopped and really looked at these kids as victims, not only of their environment, but of the system, of society as well, and figure out how to be restorative to these kids instead of being biblical and dealing with retribution against these kids.
And with what effect? One of the things that Bart Lubau says is the real tragedy is that it's unnecessary and ineffective. That the longer these kids are incarcerated, the more likely the recidivism rate is to go up.
As soon as every kid screws up. That's the definition of a teenager. You have to screw up. If you're a kid of color, the chances of you being brought into a system that's harsh or penalizing is so disproportional to a general society. When a kid crosses that threshold, of any sort of detention system where they are a prisoner, whether they're convicted or pre-adjudicated, their chances of succeeding in life fall about 50% on the other side of the threshold. So you talk about kids that are on the deep end of the system that may become so deeply involved that they become institutionalized, that it's really difficult to save them, but it's still lives at stake. And then probably 80% of them, for one reason or another, if you think they're kids that have their toes touching the water and can be diverted into useful lives if given the right resources. And I'm trying to give evidence as to who these kids are and allow policymakers to use images to frame the conversation, to change the way policy is now, but also going around to places like Penn State and trying to influence another generation. So it's multifold in my strategy here.
You mentioned race a moment ago, and there are some photographs where everyone featured is Black or Hispanic. What did you see going around the country and looking at these juvenile detention facilities?
A lot of faces of color, a lot of kids that come from backgrounds of privation, and you go into this thinking, well, a lot of these kids deserve to be there. It's not true. A lot of these kids are not affiliated as gang members. The minority are the hardcore, but they talk about their lives. We talked previously about, the 2-year-old, the unsupervised, the 12-year-old mother, babies having babies, the grandparents raising a generation. The one kid in Florida has been there 4.5 years. His mother was a 30-year crack addict. He hasn't been to trial yet. There is a Sixth Amendment in this country, but these are kids
guaranteeing everyone a speedy trial. But there isn't a ruckus if it's a teenager who is waiting 4 years for a trial?
I sit there and I talk to kids that have no voice, from families that have no resources, from neighborhoods that have no power. And they're the far end of the spectrum that something happens to my kid, I'm going to be there, not tomorrow, I'm going to be there within the hour to advocate and pay attention to them and make sure they're not in this system. But these kids, they don't have somebody speaking for them. So when I turned around and did this blog, which this is my world now, and tweet and Facebook, it became important to use the first person narrative so that their voices could be heard really directly, instead of me describing them as he said, or she said. I'm using their voice to come forward.
One of the things that Bart Lubau, writes in your book, in the foreword, is that the tide is finally changing, that in recent decades there's been a dramatic reduction in youth incarceration. And I'm wondering, for those who think we should be locking all of these kids up, what impact has that had, the reduction, on public safety?
It hasn't increased crime. So you can look at charts which are very complicated to look at, which is why I'm doing photographs to supplement complicated data. And as states have increased incarceration of kids, the crime rate has gone down. As states have decreased the incarceration of kids, the crime rate has gone down as well. So there's no correlation between locking up kids and increasing public safety. It doesn't exist. And there's clear, hard, empirical data that it's not effective in terms of helping society, and it's wasting resources.
You said once also, I respect artists that deal with surface, texture, shape, form, and concept, but my heart lies with people who try to change the world and feel they can have a difference in making people think differently. Do you remember the moment that your focus, your passion changed?
It's been a series of moments, but it's, my wife would kill me, but my most satisfying moments now, with a bad back and all, sitting in a jail cell in Miami, for example, which is way too cold, concrete, and just spending 3 or 4 hours with a kid, one kid, another kid, and listening to their story. And I just think I could be the normal, average American sitting there on a Sunday or a Monday, watching TV, watching a football game with friends, but I'm in Miami and I'm listening to this kid tell me what his life is and asking him about his father, his mother, Boo, his brother, this guy, that guy. And it's so unbelievably rewarding that as I'm doing it, I just think, I'm so privileged. It's amazing. I don't know how I got here, but I'm so grateful to be in this cell.
And you feel a responsibility to do something with that experience.
How do you not? You have to share this. I've spent a lifetime in like museums showing the world attics and basements that they can't get to bomb shelters, trying to explore a world of people that are survivalists or fear the ultimate apocalypse. And it's always been trying to gather information that's been not available. And here I am in the mother lode of it.
All right, Richard Ross, thank you so much for talking with us.
Pleasure being here.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Richard Ross. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also be able to view photographs from Ross's book, Juvenile In Justice. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
If you've enjoyed Conversations from Penn State and would like to purchase a DVD of this show or any of our other episodes, order online at mediasales.psu.edu or call 1-800-770-2111.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.